Welcome to today's webinar for Brandwood CKC. This webinar is released on April 15th, 2021, and it will be focused on innovative product regulatory strategies and considerations for medical devices and diagnostics. My name is Luis Jimenez, and I'll be your presenter today. For those who might not know, Brandwood CKC is an international regulatory and quality consulting firm. Our headquarters are in Sydney, Australia, and we bring a global perspective to medical device regulatory and quality consulting. Our team combines complementary technical strengths and diversity with a shared commercial focus and global market to view all areas of therapeutics and diagnostics. A little bit about myself. I'm the VP of Business Development. I have over 12 years of experience, both running a startup company and also working for large organizations in GMP manufacturing, regulatory affairs, project management, and program management. Our agenda for today will cover a lot. We'll first start with the clinical considerations, both in clinical evidence. Real-world evidence is a hot keyword these days. We'll also cover preclinical considerations, quality systems, and then regulator meetings, innovative pathways, including breakthrough designations and rare disease designations. And we'll conclude with summary and conclusions. Some key considerations for innovative products and also product changes. As I did the research for this presentation and put together thoughts, I thought we'd start with these overarching ideas that really should be encompassing the development of innovative products. First, the structure is critical to leverage all activities. Yes, it's an innovative technology. Yes, we want to get it to the market as quick as possible, but the more that the development program can be structured and planned, the more the activities can be leveraged from a regulatory standpoint. We want to understand evolving definition of clinical evidence. I'll expand a little bit on that, but it's not only relying on clinical trials. That definition is ever evolving, more so these days. With applied regulatory best practices is key from a regulatory perspective, of course, to know what are the current regulatory practices and explore, or at least be aware of, all options would be our model. So jumping into the first topic, the first recommendation applying regulatory controls in product innovation is to know the basis very well. Remember, clinical evidence is now globally recognized as all available data, including primary data and secondary data. Waiting to start the clinical evaluation report, the CER, until it is ready to be submitted is a disservice. For example, it would be great to learn what the failure rates and key adverse events are for comparable products as early as possible to learn where to focus on for the new product. So for innovative devices, knowledge is key. That's a model would bring to the table. We cannot think of a better way to be informed than to start with a clearly defined clinical evaluation plan that specifies that at first stage, the CR will be drafted as early as possible. It doesn't have to be formally approved, but it can be maintained, and that would be best throughout the development program. The CER, clinical evaluation report, are required for all device classifications in Europe and Australia. And that also applies for IVDs, and the counterpart in IVDs is a performance evaluation report. When primary testing and the product development is complete and is ready for approval, we come back to the CR to run the searches and integrate all the information to complete the CR and ready it for submission. Although a CR is not required per se for the US, the information acquired in it will be key for any innovative product, especially as we will outline the analysis on equivalence. So some of the key areas that are included in the CER is the definition of state-of-the-art, the comparable products, deficiencies, global databases, and key specifications. Jumping a little bit more into detail, there are 4 key aspects of CERs which are also key to innovative product development. Key aspects of CERs and performance evaluation reports under MedDev 2.7.1 Rev 4. CERs and PRs are required for all classification of medical devices. There are important considerations, including clinical trials, all direct clinical data, Anything that is in process should be disclosed. The concept of equivalence, it must be the same intended purpose as the subject device if we're going to claim substantial equivalence, but also similar products should be evaluated. In terms of the literature, we should define the state of the art. It includes similar products and it provides objective critical appraisal of publications. The post-market is also a critical aspect. So moving into the critical appraisal, it indicates the objective analysis of the data. We have the literature, we have the post-market data, the clinical trial data. All of this is evaluated for both the existing technology and intended for an established and accepted use. New or improving technology, the extension of existing technology to a new clinical use should have direct clinical data. And as we move through the critical appraisal, we would generate data on hazards and risks. Again, this will be very critical for the development process of any innovative technology. There's data on performance in clinical use. It will generate favorable or unfavorable scientific data. We wanted to emphasize there is a webinar, if we wanted to dive deeper, that really jumps into these topics. So now moving into a novel subject, real-world evidence has been forefront of regulatory innovation, specifically in the US. So we're going to focus on the guidance document for real-world evidence and also a very recent report published by the FDA where it actually provides examples of the real-world evidence. So the big question is, can real-world evidence be alternatives to clinical trials? And the short answer is yes. If we use registries, a collection of electronic health records, healthcare claim databases, this can provide clinical data for registration of innovative technologies, and we'll jump into some details. A review of all 2012 to 2019 FDA submissions qualified for the use of real-world data yielded 90 examples. The report also included examples from areas where innovative device technologies were being developed. 3 examples of digital health devices are included, demonstrating the validation of software as a medical device product using real-world data. And there's 2 examples utilizing patient-generated data, and 9 examples leverage device-generated data for both pre-market and post-market requirements. Key categories in the source of data. This is how the report is organized. In terms of registries, we see a lot of examples. First, leveraging national or international registries. Second, leveraging sponsor registries. Administrative claims data, it's the second section, and of course, a great source of information as well. The third would be both national registries and administrative claim data, then utilizing medical records, other sources, and then number 6 was for IVDs. So we said we were going to cover IVDs. Here's an example of real-world evidence usage for IVDs. Very interestingly, for newborn screening IVD utilizing dried blood samples, the pivotal trial for the device was embedded in a state public health laboratory routine that was in Missouri. The screening program and evaluated the device performance on all samples submitted to this state laboratory. The data from this health services office was in the active surveillance program was utilized to track reports for false negatives. The study served as a sole source of clinical evidence supporting the regulatory decision to grant the de novo classification request. I must imagine that must have saved a lot of funding when it was being leveraged from a state public laboratory screening database. The second one was de novo classification request from a new generation sequencing-based tumor profiling test. Clinical data for this submission came from an EMR database of advanced cancer patients at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. A retrospective analysis of the electronic medical records provided evidence to support a pan-cancer claim to validate a test cutoff and to provide data on somatic mutation prevalence. So that was a prime example of the use of real-world evidence to validate and to get approval for IVDs. Now for product changes, here's an interesting example. There's a modification to indications for use for a neurological stereotactic instrument supported by real-world evidence. As you can see in the summary, the 510K was submitted to modify the indications of use, including the positioning of deep brain stimulator leads. Clinical evidence for this 510K, including both literature and data from registry, that was 35 participating institutions, which collected data on the device as used in standard practice. The collected data, including placement accuracy for the DBS procedures, and the 510K submission was found to be substantially equivalent. So it's phenomenal use of real-world data, and a little bit of foresight really opens the door for leveraging existing data to get an extension of labels, new product registrations, and such. Now moving to preclinical, we wanted to focus on biocompatibility, biological safety, a very important section. And here's some key considerations for biocompatibility or biological safety. Safety evaluation, we just really need to emphasize, don't just test for it. Checking the box really, in our understanding, hampers innovation. Use all existing data to reduce the testing. So here's where the risk management system really comes into play. Evaluation and testing is done on a risk management process. The toxicological risk assessment and biological testing is used to estimate risk. Unacceptable risks that cannot be further mitigated by risk controls should be tested. This can really answer the questions of, can the risk be deemed acceptable on the basis of the patient benefit? And the risk management should be ongoing. It should not be static. One important consideration is that physical and/or chemical information is now the first column of Table A1 in the ISO 10993 2018. So this is basically universally required. Doesn't mean that all the testing has to be conducted, but that qualification of the physical and chemical characterization really needs to be addressed for all products. Again, a deeper dive. We've recently this year also provided a webinar. So here's a link if you wanted to jump more in detail into it. So here's how we envision the key steps to safety evaluation and characterization. We want to define and constrain what the type of product is. We would have a plan. We would do that first section, as we mentioned, the characterization, the chemical and physical, and that would lead into the toxicological risk assessment, which would identify what additional testing should be done through biological testing. An important thing to do is to start working on biocompatibility at the beginning of the project. It isn't something that you can just slap on the device at the end of the project. Even though biological or safety evaluation is a validation activity and has to be done on the final finished products, you should start at the beginning really thinking about this. The toxicological risk assessment and biological testing is used to estimate risk. Those risks then need to be evaluated. Are they acceptable or not acceptable? And here's where multifaceted, multidisciplined team really comes into play. So now moving into an important area, there's always that recommendation, going to regulators as early as possible is great, but there's some caveats to that. Pre-submission meetings can be a valuable tool to reduce risks and ensure that regulators are on board with plans and key decisions. However, as with all things, this needs to be carefully planned and the best practices followed to achieve the best outcome. The worst thing you want to do is to ask the regulator what he thinks you should do with an open question. The likely answer will be the most conservative option. It's their job to mitigate risk. So let's take a deeper dive on best practices and options. First, we wanted to define. We get a lot of questions. What is the pre-submission program and all the different jargon? What the overarching umbrella for the program in the US is called the Q-Sub program. We're displaying here the guidance document. It was originally the pre-IDE program in 1995 for IDE applications. Over time, the pre-IDE program evolved to include feedback on PMAs, de novo requests, and 510K submissions, and to determine whether a clinical study required submission on IDE. Well, a lot of things happened and evolved, and actually in 2017, the FDA defined the Q-Sub program with scheduling and timing of FDA feedback for pre-subs. Here are outlined the types of meetings, the key types of meetings. So we have pre-submission meetings, informational meetings, study risk determination, submission issue request, and breakthrough device applications. So now we said we were going to bring a global perspective. If we look at European Union with MDR and IVDR, even so more, notified bodies will not provide a pre-submission per se or informative meetings. There is a technical review process. There's some risk because the recommendations tend to be more of a binding nature and they're separate from the notified bodies. So there might be a disconnect there. We want to say that Australia and the TGA has a pre-submission process with the same level of professionalism as the FDA. So kudos to that. Now jumping into the best practices, we often with clients do a risk reward benefit analysis. So the benefits of the pre-submission will be opportunities to resolve hard matters. It also very helpful for investors as a signal to build rapport and enhance transparency. It provides a smoother and potentially shorter time frames and early regulatory feedback. And generally speaking, both for FDA and for TGA, there are no fees. But here are the risks. First impressions might have implications. So don't make a bad first impression. Don't go so early that you're really not educated. Once submitted, you can't retrieve it. And be careful for what you ask for. We talked about the open-ended questions, and that's just really a bad practice to ask, what do you think FDA we should do? Should we run a 1,000 patient study or use rationale? And usually the answer will be the most conservative one. So yes, early communication is great, but too early can be a risk. So do's and don'ts and best practices. Questions should be concise and guided. Open-ended questions will only result in a conservative answer. Reference standards as much as you can. Demonstrate that you have done your homework. The last thing we want is to be pointed to an obvious reference standard or guidance document where the answers to our questions were clearly delineated. Provide sufficient background information and context to answer the questions. Ask for clarifications when needed and follow best meeting practices. Here's the don't. Don't treat a regulator as a consultant. It's not their job. The job is to evaluate. Yes, there's some level of advice, but it's not their job to answer our questions on what we should do for our development program. Don't forget that you're the top expert in your product. That's very important. Don't be unprepared and make a bad impression. We named that twice because it's so important. Don't change the content or questions at the last minute. That really will irritate regulators. And don't be confrontative, but also don't be completely tractable. We're making a negotiation with the regulator, so we want to really make sure we're standing on the sound basis of science. And so there is some room for negotiation, but being confrontative will be a spelling for bad things. Moving into quality systems and MDSAP, there can be innovation considerations on the quality system. And for us, MDSAP really encompasses the next stage of how innovative regulatory strategies can be applied to commercialized technologies for product changes. MDSAP stands for Medical Device Standardized Audit Program. And I'm just going to name the 5 key stakeholders and how they use the MDSAP certification. Starting from Canada, Canada has made it a requirement. So any early innovator who's thinking of commercializing a product globally, and that includes Canada, there is a requirement for a quality system certification. The US recognizes MDSAP, one of the key stakeholders. Anvisa will also recognize in Brazil the MDSAP certification. Japan uses this as also manufacturing evidence. And interestingly, Australia now uses MDSAP for registration purposes. So whereas before Australia would only recognize a 13485 and CE mark, now MDSAP certification plus a 510K or Japanese or Canadian approval, so long as the same product risk category is observed, generally can be used to register new novel products in Australia. I also wanted to mention the World Health Organization, WHO, is an observer MDSAP, and that the European Union are official observers as well. So at some point, maybe after they're done with MDR and IVDR and Brexit, they might be recognized as MDSAP as well. If you want a deeper dive and then what MDSAP, what that entails, here's also a link that we did this year recently. And let's jump into the benefits of MDSAPs. Regulators included in the MDRF will use MDSAP audit and its reports to substitute for the evidence of manufacturers' QMS certifications. These countries will not require additional country-specific audits and may create more pathways for product regulatory approvals in these target markets. So the regulators reserve the right to still do a for-cause audit, but essentially by signing into the MDSAP voluntary program, if there's not a for-cause audit requirement, for example, FDA, Canada, or Japan, they will not come and do a surveillance audit. That's generally speaking the benefit for MDSAP. The process and basic requirements for ISO 13485 and MDSAP are basically aligned, but there's some significant differences. This includes inclusion of geography-specific information. It also includes a point-based non-conformity grading system that has to be very carefully observed. The MDSAP audit requires 2 stages in the initial assessment. However, from an innovative regulatory strategy standpoint, how we envision it is that really the gap between ISO 13485 and MDSAP is about 20%. And if we ask the notified body to do the certification audits for both, it really doesn't create a significant additional hurdle and amount of work. So that's sort of something to think about early on, and we believe it's a really good example of innovative strategic thinking. Now, jumping into details for more classical considerations when we're talking about innovative products, let's talk about breakthrough designations. Breakthrough designations are something that is really exciting for innovators. Let's talk about the criteria for the US. The first criteria is really constitutes the device should provide more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human diseases or conditions. That has to be documented in the application for a breakthrough device. Secondly, one of the following needs to be met. The device represents a breakthrough technology. No approved or cleared alternative exists. Device offers significant advantages over existing cleared or cleared alternatives, and device availability is in the best interest of patients. Now, a couple of caveats. Multiple devices with the same intended use can be issued breakthrough designation, but only one, the first one, will be approved. Once that first product is approved, the FDA has reserved the right to not continue to issue breakthrough designation, probably because the device would no longer represent a direct breakthrough. Now, there could be multiple products for the same indication, disease, but not with the same indication. I also wanted to mention that the Breakthrough Device Program superseded the Expedited Access Pathway and the Innovation Pathway. Here are the benefits of getting a breakthrough device. The submission program now becomes interactive, and FDA is pressured to provide more timely communication. There will be pre and post-market balance on data collection. Efficient and flexible clinical study design can be applied and often recommended. Here's one of the few examples where the FDA would really collaborate to identify what would be the most efficient way to get the product registered. There will be review team support. Senior management will be engaged from the FDA standpoint. The submission comes a priority in terms of review so that there is a shortened time frame, and there are manufacturing considerations from PMA submissions. An additional benefit, which unfortunately is now on hold, is that the Medicare coverage of innovative technologies, the MCIT, as of January of 2021, had approved an instantaneous coverage for Medicare for any product that got approved by FDA through the Breakthrough Device Program. Unfortunately, the program is currently on hold. There's an open consultation that is evaluating how the coverage could be determined and what kind of controls. So it seems like the benefit kind of got a little bit ahead of the curve, and now they're pulling back, but our hopes is that that will be reinstated because it really provides a tremendous opportunity for getting innovative technologies covered instead of that reimbursement process being so lengthy. There's other novel programs worth mentioning from FDA. Of course, there's quite a number of them, but here's two that I particularly wanted to mention. The Product Development Protocol, the PDP, is applicable to PMAs, Class 3 products in the US. Essentially, the FDA will agree on the product development plan, and if that protocol is followed, then basically that is sort of providing the game plan for approval. The FDA will agree on the design and development criteria, and the information is provided in modules to FDA. And so there could be more interactive feedback. There's another one called the Safety and Performance-Based Abbreviated 510K Pathway. This is for Class 2 products. It's part of the Modernization 510K program. It applies for product approval based on testing standards as opposed to comparative testing. Remember that 510K is a approval pathway only for substantial equivalence of Class 2 products. So with this new process, you can get a product approved without substantial equivalence based on consensus standards. However, there is a limited number of product-specific consensus standards, so the program is intended to continue to grow in the near future. Now, moving into Australia's priority review designation. Australia does have a priority review designation. It is modeled after the US. I was reading the consultation document when they were considering how to structure this. Really, the benefit is it provides the top of the queue. So it's intended to be a faster approval. Here are the conditions, again, very similar to the US. There's a serious condition, unmet need, and breakthrough technology or clinical advantage or public health benefit. However, it really should be used very differently than the FDA's approval process. Here's why. For a priority review designation, there is an expectation that the full application will be submitted 6 months after receiving the priority review designation. So that really means that companies need to make this application when they're ready to submit the full documentation for the application. It can't be 6 months, longer than 6 months. There is a way to renew the priority review designation, but it's not the best, not advisable. So I did want to mention there's a fee for this priority review application of about 9,000 Australian dollars as of 2018 as of today. The designation decisions, unlike the US, they will be published on the TGA website after you have been notified. Applications with a granted priority review designation will be allocated front of queue priority throughout the relevant assessment process. This includes TGA's business processes associated with the applications for conformity assessment and inclusion in the ARTG for medical devices. So what's happening in Europe? I thought it'd be best narrated here by MedTech Europe. MedTech Europe is the European Trade Association for Medical Technology and Industry, including medical devices, diagnostics, and the such. MedTech Europe's mission is to make innovative medical technologies available to more people. Here's the conclusion 2019. In addition to the lack of expert panels, MDR designated notified bodies have no spare capacity to evaluate files for new innovative products, neither under the MDR nor via the grace period. This has created an innovation backlog which presents the risk that European patients risk losing out versus those in other parts of the world. So unfortunately, the impact of MDR and IVDR does not look the most positive to innovative technologies, but nonetheless, we're working with companies that have managed to overcome these hurdles and are certainly way in the way to meeting MDR certification or IVDR. And so it's not universal, but certainly an impediment at the moment. An innovative pathway which cannot be complete in terms of an analysis without touching on rare diseases or orphan device designations. This program, again spearheaded by the US, really offers some very unique advantages for innovative technologies, even those that are not particularly solely applicable to rare diseases or solely developed for rare diseases. Here's a little bit about that. So in the US, the Humanitarian Device Exemptions, the HDE, is the approval for rare disease indicated medical devices or diagnostic products. It's a two-step process. First, the HUD, humanitarian use device, needs to be issued, and then the HDE. A rare disease is defined by each country according to their population, but in the US, as of most recently, it means that no more than 8,000 people are affected in the US. There's a requirement that there's no similar product. And I wanted to mention there's about 7,000 known rare diseases. An HDE is exempt from the effectiveness requirements, but requires probable benefit. What that means is that by default, these products are PMA, class 3 products. And what the FDA would really apply risk assessment to the risk-benefit ratio on approval of the products. There's not a full requirement that the product needs to be clinically validated, but that there needs to be a probable benefit. And I'll jump a little bit more into what that means with some more details. Here's some nuances to going down the rare device, the rare disease device certification. It can only be sold to recuperate cost. There's a cap, not for profit. And as of recently, there is a for-profit sales, a module for these types of products. The device must be labeled as such and can only be used in IRB under IRB approval with an appropriate local committee for treatment. And the treatment needs to be for pediatric patients or an adult population where the development of the device is highly impracticable. There's a limit of 8,000 doses, annual distribution number, on these products for profit. So if we compare the difference between a PMA and a HDE, the indication of use is proposed by the applicant with the PMA, and the HDE is based on the HUD designation. The safety needs to have a reasonable assurance for the PMA. And here's where we see the difference. It will not expose patients to an unreasonable significant risk for illness or injury. On the effectiveness side, of course, a PMA will require a clinical trial. And here's what we're talking about. For the HDE, there has to be a demonstration of probable benefit. And there's an exemption for demonstrating effectiveness for the approval. The FDA review timeline is significantly smaller. There are restrictions for profit, and the product can only be used under IRB approval. If we go on to those guidance documents, however, it does show the huge benefit that starting on a rare disease, not only talking about helping people's lives that don't have other options, but also about the benefit that generating early clinical data on a small patient population can do to then be leveraged to then acquire the PMA or to accelerate the product development pathway, specifically also for pediatric applications. HDE tends to be a tremendous way to consider. Now, as good as the HDE program sounds, it's nearly as good as an orphan drug or biologic sort of benefits. And it really is indicative of the cost, of course, of developing drugs versus devices. We know that the orphan drug here there is an exclusivity for 7 years. There's pricing discretion. The clinical trial is somewhere where really, I guess, the humanitarian use device does have significant improvement. There's clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness are similar to non-orphan products in the orphan drug designation. And you can see the other areas where the comparison between orphan and humanitarian use devices maybe has still room for improvement. So if we were to ask what's the position of European Union, there's no existing framework for devices. The EMA does have a significant benefits for orphan drug, as we have outlined, very similar to that in the US, but there isn't something for devices. Now, Australia is the same. There's an orphan designation for pharmaceutical products, but there isn't an existing framework for devices. I wanted to share this article, this NIH and FDA published report. They identified there's a significant need, specifically in the pediatrics. They need 66% of respondents, of clinicians, said that they need implants that have the capability of growing with the children as opposed to revision surgeries. And more than 2/3 cited a need for an entirely new device for rare diseases. I mean, just the statistics are there. There's a tremendous need. And I would say that innovative technologies can really potentially find opportunities to bring products to market earlier through similar iterations for rare diseases and specifically for pediatrics. So I'm going to jump now into summary and conclusions. We covered a lot, but some key points. I think this table really summarizes some key considerations between the three territories that we're covering today: the US, Europe, and Australia. In terms of rare disease, for devices, the US provides faster access to market. There's a limitation of 8,000 annual units per year in terms of profit as well, but there's nothing similar in Europe and Australia. The breakthrough designation, the priority review, you have to have a high unmet need in the US. It provides you for a very interactive process. It's not necessarily faster. Currently, the statistics don't support that it's faster, but certainly the interaction makes it very beneficial for the developers. In Europe, it's not available. We'll see how many notified bodies do adopt this, but under MDD, there was the ability to pay twice the fees and get a somewhat of an expedited review. With the current backlogs, probably MDR might not allow that. In Australia, there is a breakthrough designation for high clinical data required, but it does have high clinical data requirements, and there must be a submission of the full package within 6 months. Now, there is also new opportunities related to COVID-19 pandemic. I did want to cover that briefly. Provisional approvals in emergency use authorization. Of course, they have to be related to a pandemic in all instances. For FDA, we want to say that the templates are phenomenal guidance on how what the US will be requiring, and there are EUAs open for multiple modalities of treatment and diagnostics for COVID-19. In Europe, of course, it has to be pandemic related, but you would work with one of the competent authorities that would issue the provisional approval, and that would be then submitted to the other competent authorities. In Australia, it has to be pandemic related, and there's an additional benefit that TGA fees are waived or reduced. Conclusion, regulatory requirements are the result of the consensus of best practices. So if we adopt that mindset, there certainly can be opportunities to apply innovative thought process and concepts to bring in innovative technologies to the market. I included this figure because it really emphasizes all the different aspects of the life cycle of a product. And at each point, there is room for innovative regulatory strategy considerations. We emphasize that the conservative check-the-box approach can really hamper innovation. It should be risk-based. There should be a lot of logic to what tests are done. A risk-based management of the development process can create significant savings, and maintaining a global perspective and a total product life cycle perspective throughout the whole process of innovation, of bringing changes or new technologies to the market, can bring tremendous value for both the quality of life of patients and also for the manufacturers. So with that, I conclude my presentation. I'm going to address some questions that we have received, and we hope that you have enjoyed this presentation. So the first question, there was a question, we were going to cover the de novo pathway. Can we elaborate on that? The de novo pathway is somewhat new. The FDA sort of corrected their stance, and that previously there was a requirement to do a 510K, and they get that rejected and then do the de novo application, and now there's a way to directly apply for and request a de novo classification. This applies to class 2 products. They are so innovative that there isn't an appropriate code by FDA in the FDA database of a similar product. So again, for class 2 products, there is that pathway of de novo for innovative technologies, and the FDA now has opened the application pathway for that determination to be done directly. There are some questions here. Which trends do you anticipate in the next years in consequence of COVID-19? There's also AI, MDR, and IVDR rollout, and the increasing role of China in the medical device markets. We anticipate the diagnostics to be significantly improved in the breadth and depth of its validations. Many companies will be going through a 510K after obtaining EUA for COVID-19, and that will just increase the robustness of, I think, the testing capability. So I jumped first to the COVID-19. So we believe that's going to be very positive for the diagnostic industry. In terms of AI, we have done webinars on software as medical device. There are noteworthy new regulations really now defining software as medical device that include AI, of course, and also software in medical device that include AI, both from the IMDRF and also FDA and major regulators like TGA. I wanted to mention an exciting one, that's the Center of Excellence pilot program for software as medical device. The FDA is spearheading. It's a phenomenal program. In terms of the MDR and IVDR, we wanted to reemphasize CERs and PRs and post-market surveillance are the key, really. That will be significantly improved in terms of what evidence manufacturers have. There's no grandfathering in of products, and so it's turning the equation on its head. A statistic that really illustrates it, for example, for IVDRs. Now IVDs will, 90 to 80% of them will be have to undergo review by a notified body, whereas before 20% of them have previously only 20% been reviewed. China has recently issued new medical device mandate, and this is in theory allowing new pathways to not require type testing. And there's also possible clinical trial exemptions beyond the exemptions listing. So that's a great progress in regards to China. Now, we also had a question on why the TGA is requiring declaration of conformity for inclusion of low-risk medical device, for example, class 1. This was done to ensure proper classification for risk devices, for low-risk devices, and ensure compliance. The TGA was noticing more and more companies registering products that didn't have to be registered basically for marketing purposes. Some registering companies were seeking a class 1 registration where in reality they would be a class 2. So we've actually authored a couple of articles that cover this topic in detail, but essentially TGA is modernizing the registration process. Now it's requiring declaration of conformity for low-risk products, and that allows them to also run autonomous verifications, sort of software screening. Here's the last question we will address. Does the 510K apply to anti-infectious coating on orthopedic devices? The 510K relies on predication. If there is a suitable predication, then the pathway can be used. Because the use of antibacterial, antimicrobial coatings adds a significant functional component to the implant, it would require a suitable predicate with antibacterial function to be found. In that assessment, there is a lot of differences in the types of coatings out there, so it may not be as straightforward as finding any predicate with antibacterial coating. If there's not a suitable predicate, it is likely that the de novo pathway would be appropriate. In the event that the coating for the claims of it adds significant risk to inpatient, it might even be a class 3 product and require a PMA. So that does it for the questions. Here's ways to be in touch. We provide monthly free webinars. Please register to our database to ensure that you receive them. Visit our website to see our library. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you next month.